There is a place along the southwest coast of Florida where the land and the water have never quite agreed on where one ends and the other begins. You can stand on what appears to be solid ground, a quiet, wooded island rising gently from a tidal estuary, and feel the firmness beneath your feet without suspecting that the ground itself is not entirely natural. The trees are real. The mangroves reaching into the shallow water are real. The herons standing motionless at the edge of the tide are real. And the warm, salt-touched air moving slowly across the bay at dusk, carrying the sound of distant water against shell and root, that is real too. But the ground beneath you is something different than it appears. In places along this coast, on islands like Mound Key, on ridges at sites like Pineland, on elevated promontories scattered across the Calusa River region and the margins of Estero Bay, the soil beneath the surface is not soil in the geological sense. It is shell. Enormous quantities of shell, accumulated across generations, layer by careful layer, until what had once been water-level sand and sediment became raised, habitable ground. Whelk shells and oyster shells and clam shells and the discarded remains of countless meals and seasons and years, compressed under their own weight into something that functions, in every practical sense, as land. This is the southwest coast of Florida, and this is where the Calusa built their world. If you enjoy slow journeys into the overlooked and partially forgotten landscapes of American history, you can subscribe to History's Sleepy Time and travel with us through more of them. There is no urgency here, only the long, patient work of looking at what remains. The shells are the beginning of the answer, but they are also only the beginning. The name Calusa comes to us largely through Spanish colonial records, the documents of a people who arrived from across the Gulf of Mexico in the 16th century and found, to their considerable surprise, a coastal kingdom that had no interest in becoming part of theirs. The Calusa were not wandering bands. They were not a scattering of small fishing communities living hand-to-mouth along a forgotten coastline. They were a politically organized, economically sophisticated, and environmentally knowledgeable indigenous society whose influence extended across much of what is today southern Florida, from the Gulf Coast to the interior wetlands, from the 10,000 islands in the south to the pine flatwoods in the north, and across a network of waterways that connected dozens of communities into a single coherent political world. Their capital, if we are willing to use that word carefully, appears to have been on or near an island in Estero Bay that archaeologists and historians now call Mound Key. And the question that island raises, even today, even to a casual observer standing on its elevated shell surface and looking out across the still water, is a quiet but persistent one. How did this come to be? How did coastal people transform shells, water, estuaries, fish, and mangrove islands into the foundation of a kingdom? And what happened to that world? The Calusa world that the Spanish encountered in the 16th century did not emerge suddenly from an empty coastline. It had deep roots reaching back not hundreds, but thousands of years into a human story that had been unfolding along the southwest coast of Florida since long before any European vessel had crossed the Atlantic. Archaeological evidence makes clear that people have lived in this region for an extraordinary length of time. The earliest human presence in Florida dates back well over 10,000 years, to a period when the climate was cooler and drier, when sea levels were considerably lower than they are today, and when much of what is now the shallow Gulf shelf was dry land. The people who first moved through this landscape inhabited a Florida that would be almost unrecognizable today. A landscape of springs, rivers, open woodlands, and megafauna that included mastodons and giant ground sloths. That ancient Florida is gone, and much of its archaeological record is now submerged beneath the Gulf of Mexico. But as the climate warmed and sea levels rose through the early millennia of the Holocene, the landscape transformed gradually into something closer to what we see today. An intricate coastal mosaic of estuaries, mangrove forests, tidal flats, barrier islands, freshwater rivers, and inland wetlands. And as the environment changed, the people who lived within it adapted. They learned the rhythms of the estuaries. They learned the seasonal patterns of fish migration, shellfish abundance, and coastal resources. They built their knowledge of this particular landscape over generations, passing that understanding forward through practice and experience. Archaeological sites in southwest Florida preserve evidence of long-term coastal occupation reaching back several thousand years. Shell deposits at sites in the Calusa region and along the Pine Island Sound area have been dated to well before the Common Era, indicating sustained human presence and the gradual development of a distinct regional cultural tradition. Archaeologists working in this area have used the term Calusa culture to describe the broad archaeological tradition associated with the peoples of southwest Florida, a tradition that shows continuity across many centuries before European contact. What this means in practical terms is that the Calusa society encountered by Spanish explorers in the 1500s was not a new creation. It was the product of an enormously long process of coastal adaptation, accumulated environmental knowledge, population growth, and the gradual development of political complexity. The shells in the middens and mounds of the region represent not just food remains, but time itself, thousands of years of human relationship with a particular stretch of coastline. The society that eventually became recognizable as the historically documented Calusa emerged from this deep foundation. It was shaped by geography, by the extraordinary abundance of estuarine resources, by trade and interaction with neighboring peoples, and by the internal development of political structures that could organize and manage a complex coastal world. By the time any Europeans set eyes on the Gulf Coast of southwest Florida, the people living there had already been shaping that landscape and being shaped by it for a very long time. That is where the story begins, not with a Spanish ship on the horizon, but with the long patience of people who had always been here. The name we use, Calusa, comes to us filtered through colonial records, and its precise origin and original pronunciation remain matters of scholarly discussion. Early Spanish documents use varying spellings, including Calusa, Caluz, and other forms, and the name may derive from a Calusa word, though the exact meaning is uncertain. The people themselves, of course, had their own name for themselves, which has not been preserved in surviving records in a way that allows confident reconstruction. We speak of the Calusa by a name that reached us through the documents of people who were, in most cases, either attempting to convert them, conquer them, or record enough about them to serve colonial administrative purposes. With that acknowledged, what can we say with reasonable confidence about who the Calusa were? The Calusa occupied the southwest coast of Florida and a substantial portion of the interior of the Florida Peninsula south of Tampa Bay. Their territory, as best as archaeology and historical documents can reconstruct it, encompassed the Caloosahatchee River region, the estuary system of Pine Island Sound, Charlotte Harbor, and the waters around Estero Bay extending southward through the 10,000 islands and into the coastal fringe of what is today the Everglades region. This was not a small territory. It covered a substantial portion of southern Florida, encompassing hundreds of miles of coastline, dozens of islands, an intricate network of rivers and tidal channels, and vast areas of interior wetland. Within this territory, the Calusa maintained dozens of settlements. These were not isolated villages, but communities within an organized political system. Spanish documents from the 16th century describe a hierarchical structure with a paramount chief, a ruler whose authority extended over subordinate communities and whose power derived from a combination of political, military, and religious authority. The Calusa ruler commanded tribute from subject communities and exercised influence that extended even beyond his immediate territory, into the lands of neighboring peoples who maintained various kinds of relationships with the Calusa, some cooperative, some tributary, some more ambiguous. Calusa society was stratified. There were distinctions between elite and commoner, between those who held specialized roles and those who did not. The ruler and his family occupied a position of elevated authority, backed by both political organization and what Spanish observers described as elaborate ceremonial and religious life, though those descriptions must be understood as filtered through European eyes and European assumptions about what religious practice looked like. The Calusa language has not survived in a form that allows full reconstruction. What we have are scattered words and phrases recorded in colonial documents, enough to confirm that the language was distinct from other indigenous languages of Florida and the broader Southeast, but not enough to reconstruct it as a living system of communication. The Calusa were not, despite occasional misconceptions, an agricultural people in the conventional sense. They did not clear fields and plant crops as the primary basis of their economy. Their wealth came from the water. And to understand how a non-agricultural society could support a complex, stratified political system, you have to understand the particular quality of the water that surrounded them. Stand at the edge of Estero Bay on a calm morning and look outward across the water. The bay stretches before you in the soft grey light before sunrise, its surface barely moving, broken only by the occasional passage of a mullet or the silent adjustment of a great blue heron standing on an exposed shell flat. Beyond the near shore, mangrove islands rise low and dark against the brightening horizon. Further still, the open gulf lies somewhere behind the barrier islands, separated from the bay by a narrow strip of sand and vegetation. This is a place of extraordinary ecological richness, and it has been so for a very long time. Estuaries, the places where freshwater rivers meet the sea, are among the most productive ecosystems on the planet. They are nurseries for marine life, resting grounds for migratory birds, and sources of shellfish, crustaceans, and fish in quantities that can sustain large human populations without the need for agriculture. The southwest coast of Florida is defined by estuaries. The Calusa River drains the interior of the peninsula and empties into Charlotte Harbor, mixing fresh and salt water in a zone of extraordinary biological productivity. Pine Island Sound, the shallow estuary between Pine Island and the Barrier Islands to the west, forms another vast estuarine system. And Estero Bay, sheltered from the Gulf by Estero Island and a chain of sand barriers, creates yet another calm, sheltered, biologically rich environment. The mangroves that line these waters are not merely scenery, they are structural. Their root systems trap sediment, build land, provide habitat for juvenile fish and invertebrates, and create the complex three-dimensional environment that makes the estuary so productive. Red mangroves extend their arching prop roots into the tidal zone. Black mangroves colonize the mudflats slightly higher up. Together they form a border between land and water that is neither one nor the other, a transitional space that is enormously important ecologically. For the Calusa, this landscape was not merely where they lived. It was the source of almost everything. Fish, mullet, snook, redfish, sea trout, catfish, and many others moved through these waters in seasonal abundance that could be predicted, anticipated, and managed. Shellfish, oysters, clams, whelks, conchs clustered on the tidal flats and on the roots of the mangroves in densities that seem extraordinary even by modern standards, particularly if you imagine those populations before centuries of human pressure from a very different kind of society than the Calusa. Sea turtles moved through the channels, manatees grazed on the seagrass beds, alligators patrolled the freshwater margins, deer and other terrestrial animals inhabited the pine forests and cypress swamps of the interior. The waterways themselves were roads. The Calusa River connected the coast to the interior. The tidal channels between the mangrove islands allowed canoe travel through the estuary in every direction. The shallow bays were navigable in small vessels that could move quickly and quietly through water that would challenge or stop larger craft. For people with deep knowledge of these waters, knowledge of tides, currents, seasonal fish movements, weather patterns, the behavior of specific channels and flats at different times of year, the apparent maze of water, island, and mangrove was not a barrier. It was a network. The Calusa navigated this network with canoes. Archaeological and historical evidence indicates that Calusa watercraft were constructed from local timber, likely cypress, using dugout construction techniques. Some accounts suggest canoes of considerable size capable of carrying multiple people and substantial loads. The water that might seem isolating to an outsider was, to the Calusa, the most direct path between every point of significance in their world, and the water gave them something else, something that would become the physical foundation of their settlements, their architecture, and, in a sense, their power. Pick up a single lightning wheel from a Florida beach. It fits in the palm of your hand. Its shell spirals in the particular way that whelk shells spiral, elegantly, mathematically, in a form that has not changed in millions of years. It is heavy for its size. Its surface is marked with fine ridges and faint patterns left by its growth. Inside the spiral, if the animal that made it has long since moved on, there is a smooth interior space, a cavity that once held a living creature that spent its life filtering the estuarine water of southwest Florida for food. One shell is nothing, a curiosity on the beach. But now try to hold in your mind a different image. Imagine not one shell but 10,000, then not 10,000 but 1,000,000. Then not 1,000,000, but the accumulated shells of every meal, every season, every generation of people living and eating along this particular stretch of coastline for 1,000 years, 2,000 years, longer. The shell deposits of southwest Florida represent exactly this kind of accumulation, multiplied across dozens of sites, accumulated across extraordinary lengths of time. Archaeologists use the word midden to describe refuse deposits, places where people discarded the remains of their meals and daily life. Shell middens are found at coastal sites around the world, wherever people lived near shellfish-rich waters and ate those shellfish over generations. They are, in their simplest interpretation, kitchen garbage heaps. But that description, while technically accurate, gives entirely the wrong impression of what these deposits actually are. At sites throughout southwest Florida, shell middens are not modest piles of discarded material. They are massive. They are stratified, meaning they preserve clear layers corresponding to different periods of occupation and activity. They contain not just shells, but a rich archaeological record. Fragments of ceramic vessels, shell tools fashioned from large whelks, fish bones, mammal bones, bird bones, seeds and plant materials in some conditions, and occasionally, in more restricted and respectfully studied contexts, evidence of human burials. Each layer is a chapter. Each shell is a small piece of information about what people ate, how they lived, which species were available in a particular season, and how the environment itself was changing over time. The whelk appears with particular frequency and importance in the Calusa archaeological record. The lightning whelk, which spirals in the opposite direction from most shells, was both a food source and a raw material. Large whelk shells were fashioned into cutting tools, hammers, dippers, and other implements. Whole whelks appear as objects of significance at various sites. The concentric spiral of the whelk, harvested from the same estuarine waters that fed the community, used and reused in multiple forms, threads through Calusa material culture in ways that archaeologists are still working to fully understand. Oyster shells appear in enormous quantities at many sites, reflecting the extraordinary abundance of oyster beds in the shallow tidal waters of southwest Florida. Oysters were a dietary staple, and oyster shells are the most common component of many of the largest shell deposits in the region. But oyster shells are also heavy, dense, and durable. In large quantities, they create a substrate that does not compact easily, that drains water effectively, and that maintains its elevation over time. This physical characteristic of shell, its durability and stability, as a construction material would turn out to be one of the most consequential facts about the Calusa landscape. Because the question that emerges when you stand at the edge of a large shell deposit and think about what you are looking at is not only what was thrown away here. The question becomes whether anything that looks like a natural landform in this coastal environment is actually a natural landform at all. The distinction between a refuse heap and a constructed landform is not always obvious in the archaeological record. It requires careful excavation, detailed spatial analysis, and the kind of slow, patient attention to stratigraphy and site geography that characterizes the best archaeological work. But at multiple sites in southwest Florida, that analysis has produced findings that change the way we think about what the Calusa were doing with their shell landscape. The transformation of shell from discarded food remains into an element of landscape architecture was not necessarily a single, planned decision. It may have begun simply as a consequence of accumulation, of the gradual realization that shell deposits created elevated, stable ground in a coastal environment where elevated, stable ground was otherwise scarce. Southwest Florida is remarkably flat. Much of the landscape sits barely above sea level. In a world without machinery, without imported stone or timber sufficient for large construction projects, an accumulated shell deposit rising several feet above the surrounding wetland represented something genuinely valuable: dry land. Once that value was recognized, whether consciously or through gradual practice over generations, the relationship between shell accumulation and landscape management could change. Shell that was deposited in particular places, in particular configurations, could be used to create ridges, long, elevated pathways through otherwise inundated terrain. It could be used to raise the ground level at a settlement, protecting it from tidal flooding and seasonal inundation. It could be shaped into mounds, more deliberately constructed elevated surfaces that served as platforms for buildings, or as markers of particular importance in the landscape. At Mound Key, the large island in Estero Bay that archaeological and historical evidence suggests was a major Calusa center, the landscape that visitors experience today is almost entirely made of shell. The island rises to a height of more than 30 feet in places, an extraordinary elevation for southwest Florida, and that height is composed almost entirely of shell deposits accumulated across many centuries of human occupation, and at least in part, deliberate construction. The flat-topped summit mounds that characterize the site are not natural landforms. They are human constructions built up from shell in a process that extended over a very long period. But not every elevated shell feature is a deliberately constructed monument. Archaeologists are careful to distinguish between different kinds of shell deposits because they can represent very different kinds of human activity and very different kinds of intentionality. A shell midden, in the technical sense, is primarily a refuse deposit, material that accumulated through the regular discard of food remains and other waste, though it may have been shaped or managed in ways that gave it additional functions over time. A shell mound is a more deliberately constructed elevation, a feature built up purposefully rather than simply accumulating through discard. Shell ridges are linear elevated features that may have served as pathways, boundaries, or structural elements within a settlement. Platform mounds are flat-topped elevated features that functioned as architectural bases for buildings or as raised spaces for activities of social, political, or ceremonial significance. These distinctions matter. They tell us different things about how the Calusa thought about and used their landscape. A refuse deposit tells us about diet and daily life. A deliberately constructed platform mound tells us about social organization, the ability to coordinate labor, and the importance placed on elevating certain spaces and certain activities above the ordinary level of the ground. At Pineland, the major archaeological site complex on the eastern shore of Pine Island, shell ridges run through the site in patterns that suggest deliberate arrangement rather than random accumulation. The ridges at Pineland are substantial, broad, elevated features that rise above the surrounding terrain and that appear, from their spatial organization, to have defined areas of activity and movement within what was once a significant Calusa settlement. At other sites across the region, shell deposits are arranged in ways that archaeologists have interpreted as defining enclosed or semi-enclosed spaces, areas surrounded by elevated shell that may have served as gathering places, activity areas, or what some researchers have described using the term water courts, defined spaces associated with water management or ceremonial activity. The interpretation of these features remains a subject of scholarly discussion, and caution is appropriate. But their deliberate arrangement is difficult to explain without acknowledging that the people who created them had clear intentions for how their landscape should be organized. This is what makes the Calusa shell landscape something more than an archaeological curiosity. It is evidence of landscape thinking, of a society that understood its environment well enough to reshape it in ways that served its needs, using the one material that the estuarine world provided in virtually unlimited abundance, the shell of the sea. It is easy, when studying a society primarily through its landscape and its archaeological remains, to lose the human beings inside the evidence. The shell ridges and platform mounds and middens become the subject, and the people who built them, lived on them, cooked beside them, raised children on them, and looked out from them across the same estuarine water that you can see today begin to recede into abstraction. The archaeology becomes the story and the people become the backdrop, so it is worth pausing here and trying to bring the human scale back into view. The Calusa lived in a coastal world that was, by most material measures, comfortable and reliable. Their settlements sat on elevated shell ground above the tidal margins, protected from the ordinary flooding that made lower ground uninhabitable. Their homes based on what Spanish observers recorded in the 16th century and what the archaeological record can suggest, were constructed on posts, raised wooden structures that allowed air to move beneath them in the warm and humid climate of subtropical Florida, and that kept living spaces elevated above both tidal water and the insects that multiplied in the warm wetland air. The structures were likely framed with wood and covered with palm thatch, materials that were available throughout the coastal landscape and that were well suited to the climate. The Calusa did not weave heavy woolen garments or require the kind of layered clothing that colder climates demand. Spanish accounts from the 16th century describe their clothing as minimal, materials made from Spanish moss and plant fibers in some accounts, with the specific details varying between sources. The climate of southwest Florida rarely demanded more than light covering, and the practical demands of working in and around warm, shallow water would have reinforced that. What people wore, how they adorned themselves, the significance of particular materials or colors, these are aspects of Calusa life that the archaeological and historical record preserves only partially and imperfectly. What the record does preserve more clearly is the texture of daily work. Fishing was central. The construction and maintenance of weirs, nets, and other fishing equipment would have occupied a significant portion of the practical effort of a Calusa community. The processing of fish, cleaning, drying, and storing catches for later use was ongoing work in a society whose food supply depended on managing seasonal abundance carefully enough to sustain the community through leaner periods. Shell tools were made, used, maintained, and eventually discarded, contributing to the shell deposits that preserve them today. Canoes were built and repaired, a skilled and time-consuming task in a world where watercraft were as essential as roads are in a different kind of society. Children grew up in this world learning, as children everywhere learn, by watching and participating, learning to paddle a canoe through the tidal channels of Pine Island Sound, learning which tides brought which fish to which locations, learning the names of the islands, the sandbars, the channels, the places where the water changed color because the depth changed, the places where the oyster beds clustered thickest at low tide. This was a body of environmental knowledge that was enormously complex and enormously practical, built up across generations and transmitted through practice rather than through written texts. The evenings on the shell ridges would have had their own rhythms. The light changing over the water as the sun dropped behind the barrier islands to the west. The sounds of the estuary settling into its night character, the splash of fish, the calls of wading birds, the distant sound of the Gulf through the narrow passes between the barrier islands. The smell of wood smoke and the salt air and the particular warm, slightly organic smell of a mangrove estuary at low tide. These were real people living real lives in a real landscape. The shells they left behind are not just archaeological data. They are the compressed residue of ordinary human days, lived out over centuries on the coast of southwest Florida. One of the most important, and in some ways, counterintuitive aspects of Calusa society is that it achieved a level of political complexity and social stratification that is more commonly associated with agricultural civilizations, without agriculture as its economic foundation. Most of the world's complex, hierarchical political systems emerged in association with farming. Agriculture produces storable surpluses. Storable surpluses allow some people to be freed from food production. Freed from food production, those people can specialize as administrators, soldiers, priests, craftspeople, or rulers. Political hierarchies develop to manage and redistribute surplus, and eventually you get the kinds of stratified, politically organized societies that historians have traditionally associated with civilization in the conventional sense of that word. The Calusa did not follow this path. They were not farmers in any meaningful sense. And yet they maintained a stratified political system with a recognized ruler, a class of elites with specialized roles, tributary relationships with subordinate communities, and a political reach that extended across a substantial territory. The explanation lies in the water. The estuaries of southwest Florida are not merely rich. They are extraordinarily, almost uniquely rich, productive ecosystems where the mixing of fresh and salt water, the shallow depths that allow sunlight to penetrate and stimulate the growth of seagrass and algae, and the sheltering effect of the mangrove roots create conditions that support fish populations of extraordinary density and diversity. The zooarchaeological record from Calusa sites, the careful analysis of the animal bones found within shell deposits and archaeological layers, documents the range and abundance of species that the Calusa were harvesting. Mullet appear consistently and in large quantities in the faunal assemblages from Calusa sites. Mullet are schooling fish that move through estuaries in predictable seasonal patterns, making them well suited to capture in quantity with nets and weirs. Spanish observers in the 16th century remarked on the use of large nets and fish weirs by the peoples of southwest Florida. And while the specific architectural details of any fixed fishing structures are difficult to confirm definitively from the archaeological record, alone the evidence for intensive and organized fishing is very clear. Snook, redfish, sea trout, catfish, drum, and many other species appear in the faunal record alongside mullet, indicating a diversified fishing economy that could draw on different species as their availability changed with the seasons. Shellfish were gathered from the oyster beds and clam flats of the estuary in quantities that the shell deposits themselves make vividly apparent. Sea turtles were taken. Manatees appear in the faunal record. Sharks were harvested, and shark teeth appear as both food remains and as worked objects, fashioned into tools and perhaps into objects of social or ceremonial significance. The key economic insight is this: the estuarine ecosystem of southwest Florida produced resources in sufficient abundance and with sufficient predictability that a community managing those resources skillfully could generate surpluses, not surpluses of stored grain, but surpluses of dried fish, processed shellfish, and other storable marine products that could be distributed through tribute relationships and exchange networks. Archaeologist William Marquardt, who led the Calusa Culture Research Program at the Florida Museum of Natural History, and whose work has been central to modern understanding of the Calusa, has argued that the concept of a fishing chiefdom, a complex hierarchical society based on intensive fishing rather than agriculture, captures something essential about the Calusa economic model. The estuary was the field, fish were the crop. The Calusa knowledge of how to harvest, process, store, and distribute marine resources was the agricultural technology, and the extraordinary productivity of their particular coastal environment gave them a surplus foundation that could support political complexity without a single cultivated plant. This is not a minor observation. It challenges the assumption that non-agricultural societies are by definition simple or pre-political. The Calusa demonstrate that coastal environmental richness, combined with deep specialized knowledge and organized management of marine resources, can produce the economic conditions for a sophisticated political world. The water fed the kingdom. The question is, what kind of kingdom grew from that abundance? Spanish documents from the 16th century describe the Calusa ruler with a consistency that suggests he was a figure of genuine political authority, not a symbolic leader or a ritual specialist operating without real power, but someone whose decisions carried consequences, whose demands were met with compliance, and whose position was recognized by communities across a substantial territory. The most detailed Spanish accounts come from the period of sustained contact in the mid to late 16th century, when Spanish colonial officials and missionaries attempted to establish a working relationship with the Calusa leadership. These documents describe a ruler identified in various sources as Carlos, a name that appears to have been assigned or adopted during Spanish contact, probably derived from the name of the Spanish King Charles V. The original Calusa name or title of this ruler has not been preserved with certainty in the historical record, but the political reality he represented is described in enough detail across multiple sources to give us a reasonably clear, if incomplete, picture. The Calusa ruler held power that was simultaneously political, military, and religious. Spanish observers described an elaborate ceremonial life associated with the ruler's position, rituals, dances, the management of sacred objects, though those descriptions reflect the perspective of Catholic missionaries and colonial officials interpreting an unfamiliar religious world through their own assumptions and categories. What we can say with confidence is that the ruler's authority was not based on military force alone, nor on religious legitimacy alone. It was a combination, the kind of integrated political religious authority that characterized the leadership of many complex indigenous societies in the Americas. The Calusa political system was hierarchical. Below the paramount ruler were subordinate leaders, what the Spanish called principals or principal men, who governed individual communities within the Calusa territory and who owed various forms of tribute and political loyalty to the paramount chief. The Calusa ruler extracted tribute from these subordinate communities. That tribute, in a coastal economy, would have taken the form of fish, shellfish, and other resources, material goods that could be redistributed to support the ruler's household, his specialists, his warriors, and the activities of the political center. Spanish documents also describe the Calusa ruler exercising tributary authority over communities that were not themselves Calusa, neighboring groups along the Florida coast, and into the interior who were in various degrees of subordination to Calusa political power. This suggests that the Calusa paramount had built something more expansive than a simple chiefdom of closely related communities. He maintained power relationships with culturally distinct neighbors through a combination of prestige, demonstrated force, economic leverage, and political negotiation. It is important to hold these Spanish descriptions with some caution. The Spanish were observing a complex and culturally unfamiliar political system through the lens of their own political assumptions. Their descriptions were shaped by their purposes. They were trying to understand who had authority so they could negotiate with that authority, and they were trying to categorize what they saw in terms their own society would recognize. Their accounts are valuable, but they are not neutral, and they do not capture the full complexity of what the Calusa political world looked like from the inside. What archaeology can add to the picture is a sense of the material conditions that supported this political authority. The concentration of shell architecture at Mound Key, the scale of the shell platform mounds, the spatial organization of the site, is consistent with a political center where resources were concentrated and where the built environment expressed the power of those who controlled it. The distribution of settlements across the Calusa territory, with different sites showing different scales of occupation and different degrees of access to particular resources, is consistent with a hierarchical political system in which the center drew resources from the periphery and redistributed them in patterns that reinforced the authority of the center. The Calusa king was real, his power was real, and the landscape that supported and expressed that power is still there to read if you know what you are looking at. Mound Key sits in Estero Bay, approximately 4 miles from the modern shoreline near Bonita Springs, accessible today only by boat. It is a small island, about 125 acres, but it rises in places to a height that is remarkable for coastal southwest Florida, its highest shell mounds reaching more than 30 feet above sea level. From the summit of those mounds, looking out across the shallow bay in any direction, you can understand immediately why this location might have been significant. The island commands a view of the entire estuary. The channels that move through the bay are visible from the high ground. Movement across the water, canoes, boats, anything approaching from any direction would be visible from the elevated positions on Mound Key long before it reached the island itself. The island is also surrounded by water in every direction, which provides a natural boundary and a certain degree of defensibility, not the kind of fortification that stone walls provide, but the quieter security of a position accessible only by water, navigable only by those who know the channels. Archaeological research at Mound Key, conducted over multiple decades by researchers including those affiliated with the Florida Museum of Natural History and the Florida Division of Historical Resources, has confirmed the site's extraordinary archaeological importance. The mounds that give the island its name are shell mounds, composed primarily of shell material accumulated and arranged across a very long period of occupation. The site has been identified based on both its archaeological character and the correspondence between its location and descriptions in Spanish documents as a likely location for the Calusa capital, or at minimum, a major Calusa political and ceremonial center. Spanish documents from the 16th century describe the Calusa rulers' main settlement as a significant place, a location with substantial structures, including a large building capable of holding several hundred people, where ceremonies took place and where the ruler received visitors, including the Spanish. The identification of Mound Key with this described location is not absolutely proven. Archaeology rarely produces absolute proof of identification for specific historical events or places described in colonial documents. But the convergence of the archaeological evidence with the geographical and documentary record makes it a compelling and widely accepted identification among researchers. Recent archaeological work at Mound Key has produced findings that add texture to this picture. Excavations led by researchers from the Florida Museum of Natural History and collaborators from international institutions have identified what appear to be the remains of a large structure or series of structures at the site, evidence of posts and architectural features that are consistent with the kind of substantial building described in Spanish accounts. The investigation has also revealed evidence of the long duration and intensity of occupation at the site, with shell deposits reflecting sustained human activity across many centuries. The water courts at Mound Key are among the most discussed features of the site. These are defined, enclosed areas surrounded by elevated shell ridges, spaces that appear to have been deliberately bounded and that may have been associated with particular activities. The interpretation of these features as water courts, spaces that may have had functions related to fish management, to ceremonial activities involving water, or to some combination of these purposes, is archaeologically informed but remains a subject of ongoing research and debate. What is clear is that they are deliberately organized spatial features that reflect intentional landscape management at a significant scale. Standing on Mound Key today, within the state archaeological site that now protects it, the sense of layered time is palpable. The mangroves along the water's edge are growing in and on shell. The paths that wind across the island move through vegetation rooted in shell. The elevated ground beneath your feet is not geological, it is historical. Every inch of elevation at Mound Key above the natural tidal flat is the product of human hands, human choices, and the accumulated daily life of a community that lived here for a very long time. The island is quiet now. The herons stand at the water's edge. The bay moves slowly around the island's perimeter. The shells beneath the surface hold their information patiently, waiting for the next careful question from the people who come to read them. If Mound Key represents what might have been the political and ceremonial heart of the Calusa world, then Pineland, the large archaeological site complex on the eastern shore of Pine Island, represents something else: the extraordinary geographic scale and spatial organization of Calusa settlement across the broader landscape. Pine Island is the largest island on the Gulf Coast of Florida, separated from the mainland by the shallow waters of Matlacha Pass to the east, and from the Barrier Islands by Pine Island Sound to the west. It is a long, narrow island oriented roughly north to south, covered today by residential neighborhoods, citrus groves, and patches of remaining native vegetation. But beneath the surface of Pine Island, and particularly at its northern end near the modern community of Pineland, the archaeological record is dense and complex. a layered landscape of shell deposits, mounds, ridges, and other features that testifies to centuries of intensive Calusa occupation. The Pineland site complex has been the subject of sustained archaeological investigation by the Randell Research Center, which is operated by the Florida Museum of Natural History and situated on land that contains and protects a portion of the site. Research at Pineland, led over many years by William Marquardt and a team of collaborators in archaeology, paleoecology, and related fields, has produced one of the richest bodies of evidence about the Calusa that exists anywhere. The shell deposits at Pineland are substantial. The elevated ridges and mounds that characterize the site are made of shell accumulated across a period that radiocarbon dating has extended back more than 2,000 years, though the site may have been occupied for even longer. The diversity of materials found within those deposits, ceramics, shell tools, animal bones, fish remains, and occasional exotic materials that arrived through trade, reflects the full range of Calusa economic and social life at a major settlement. Among the most intriguing features at Pineland is a canal, or what archaeological investigation has identified as a likely canal. This feature, sometimes called the Pine Island Canal in the archaeological literature, appears to have been a deliberately excavated or managed channel connecting the waters of Pine Island Sound on the western side of the island to the waters of Matlacha Pass on the eastern side. If this interpretation is correct, and the evidence for deliberate modification of the waterway is reasonably strong, then it suggests that the Calusa were engaged in the management of water movement across the landscape at a scale that goes well beyond the simple accumulation of shell. A canal connecting the two sides of Pine Island would have had significant practical value. It would have shortened canoe travel routes between the open Gulf side and the mainland waterways, allowing more efficient movement of people and goods through the Calusa transportation network. It would have demonstrated organizational capacity, the ability to coordinate sustained collective labor toward a landscape modification project with long-term benefits. The paleoecological research at Pineland has been particularly valuable for understanding the environmental context of Calusa occupation. Sediment cores taken from the site and from surrounding water bodies have allowed researchers to reconstruct changes in the local environment over the period of Calusa occupation. Changes in sea level, in the extent of mangrove vegetation, in the character of the estuary, and in the way those changes interacted with human activity at the site. This research has revealed that the Calusa were not living in a static environment. The landscape was changing around them across the centuries of their occupation, and understanding how they responded to those changes is one of the ongoing questions that guides research at the site. Pineland is not a spectacular ruin in the conventional sense. There are no standing walls, no dramatic structures visible to the casual visitor. What there is, instead, is something quieter and in some ways more compelling, a dense, layered, carefully preserved archaeological landscape that rewards patient attention and systematic study. The Randell Research Center makes this landscape accessible through a nature trail that winds through the site, allowing visitors to walk across and alongside the shell features and understand, at a human scale, what this place represents. One Calusa site is significant, two begin to suggest a pattern. And the Calusa world contained many more than two. The Calusa world was not a collection of isolated settlements. It was a network, a politically and economically connected system of communities linked by water, by canoe travel, by trade, by tribute relationships, and by the shared infrastructure of a coastal society that understood its waterways the way other societies understood their roads. To move through the Calusa world was to move by water. The canoe was the vehicle of daily life, for fishing, for traveling between settlements, for carrying goods, for communication between the political center and its subordinate communities. The Calusa were accomplished canoeists, and their knowledge of the waterways of southwest Florida, the tidal channels of Pine Island, sound the mouths and lower reaches of the rivers that drain the interior, the passes between the barrier islands. The open waters of the Gulf for short coastal crossings was deep and detailed in the way that only generations of accumulated experience can produce. Spanish accounts from the 16th century remark on the watercraft of the Calusa and their evident skill in using them. The ability to move quickly through the shallow estuarine channels that made the region difficult for larger European vessels to navigate gave the Calusa a home water advantage in any encounter that involved movement on the water. They knew which channels were navigable at which states of the tide. They knew where the water was deep enough and where it was not. They knew the currents and the winds and the way the estuary behaved in different seasons and different weather. The rivers of the region extended the Calusa waterway network into the interior. The Caloosahatchee River, the most significant river in the region, connects the Gulf Coast, near what is today Fort Myers, with the vast interior wetland system of Lake Okeechobee and the broader watershed of south-central Florida. Archaeological evidence indicates that people moved along this corridor and that the Calusa maintained connections, political, economic, and social, with communities in the interior of the peninsula. Spanish documents describe the Calusa paramount exercising tributary authority over interior communities, and the Caloosahatchee corridor was likely a primary pathway through which those relationships were maintained. The question of whether the Calusa constructed canals, deliberately excavated channels that extended or modified the natural waterway network, is one that archaeological research continues to examine. The evidence at Pineland for a modified or excavated waterway crossing Pine Island is the most discussed example, but there are other locations in the southwest Florida landscape where the pattern of water features may reflect human modification rather than purely natural processes. Remote sensing technologies, including airborne LiDAR surveys that can detect subtle changes in surface topography, have been applied to the southwest Florida landscape in recent years and have the potential to reveal landscape modifications that are not visible at ground level or through conventional survey methods. The tributary relationships that Spanish documents describe were maintained through this waterway network. Communities within the Calusa territory sent tribute to the political center, goods, that traveled by canoe along the same channels used for fishing and daily movement. The center, in turn, redistributed resources downward through the hierarchy, providing the subordinate communities with access to goods, political protection, and participation in the broader Calusa world. This movement of goods and people along the waterways was not merely economic, it was political. The flow of tribute toward the center and the flow of redistribution away from it were the material expression of the political relationships that held the Calusa world together. The water that looked to a Spanish sailor approaching from the Gulf, like a trackless maze of islands and channels, was, to the Calusa, a precisely known and carefully managed landscape, a world whose every passage and anchorage had a name, a character, and a place in the mental map of everyone who lived and moved within it. That map existed only in memory and practice. It was never written down. It did not need to be. The Calusa world was coastal, but it was never closed. One of the more striking aspects of the archaeological record from southwest Florida is the evidence it preserves of connections reaching far beyond the immediate coastal environment, connections to neighboring indigenous peoples across the Florida peninsula, to communities in the interior, and through networks of exchange that carried materials and objects across distances that seem, given the technology of the time, quite remarkable. The most vivid evidence of these long-distance connections comes in the form of exotic materials, objects and substances that could not have been produced locally and that must therefore have traveled to southwest Florida through some form of exchange. Stone is perhaps the most telling of these materials. Southwest Florida has essentially no natural stone. The limestone bedrock that underlies much of Florida lies deeply buried beneath sediment and surface deposits in the southwest coastal region, and there is no local source of the kinds of stone suitable for tool making. Yet stone tools and stone objects appear in the archaeological record of Calusa sites. They are not common, but their presence is unambiguous, and it raises the immediate question of where they came from and how they got here. Some stone materials in southwest Florida archaeological assemblages appear to have origins in the interior of the Florida peninsula or in the broader southeastern region. Chert, the flint-like stone used for flaked tools, occurs naturally in parts of north and central Florida, and pieces of worked chert found at southwest Florida sites indicate that some form of exchange or movement was connecting this coastal region to the interior. Other exotic materials at Calusa sites include copper, a metal with a deep and widespread significance across many indigenous societies of eastern North America, which does not occur naturally in Florida and must have arrived from distant source regions through trade networks. Ceramics provide another window into Calusa connections. The pottery found at Calusa sites includes locally produced wares made from local clay tempered with local materials. But it also includes ceramics that appear to be non-local in origin, vessels or sherds that may have been produced by neighboring peoples, and that arrived at Calusa sites through exchange or social interaction. The study of ceramic distributions across the Florida peninsula and the broader Gulf Coast region reveals patterns of interaction and connection that cross what might look on a map, like obvious natural or cultural boundaries. The Calusa also had connections to the peoples of the Florida Keys and of the Caribbean margins. Archaeological evidence from sites in South Florida suggests interaction between coastal peoples of the peninsula tip and island communities to the south and east, and some researchers have noted the presence of materials in Florida archaeological contexts that may reflect connections to the broader Caribbean world. The details of these potential connections remain a subject of ongoing research and discussion, but the general picture of a Calusa world embedded in a larger web of indigenous exchange and interaction is well supported by the archaeological evidence. Within the Florida Peninsula, the Calusa maintained relationships with neighboring peoples in ways that the Spanish documents describe as ranging from tributary to more equal and cooperative. To the north, along the Gulf Coast, communities of related or affiliated peoples occupied the territory between the Calusa heartland and the Tampa Bay region. To the east, interior peoples including communities associated with the Lake Okeechobee Basin maintained connections with the coastal Calusa. Spanish documents describe the Calusa paramount receiving not only tribute, but also visitors, emissaries, and sometimes family members from subordinate or allied communities, the social fabric of a regional political world maintained through personal relationships as well as economic exchange. Shell itself was a trade commodity. Southwest Florida produced shell in extraordinary abundance and worked shell objects, shell tools, shell ornaments, and other manufactured items made from the whelks and conchs of the estuary appear at archaeological sites well beyond the Calusa territory, suggesting that the products of the Southwest Florida shell beds traveled outward through exchange networks just as stone and copper traveled inward. The Calusa world, in short, was not an isolated coastal enclave. It was a node in a larger network of indigenous relationships. And its political power was partly a product of its position in that network. Its control of a rich coastal resource based its ability to produce and distribute shell and marine products, and its political relationships with the communities that occupied the broader South Florida landscape. And then, in the early decades of the 16th century, the network encountered something entirely new. The Gulf of Mexico in the early 16th century was becoming, gradually and then with increasing speed, a Spanish sea. Spanish ships had crossed the Atlantic, established colonies in the Caribbean, explored the coastlines of Central America and the Gulf Coast of Mexico. Spanish maps were being drawn and redrawn as each new expedition returned with descriptions of coastlines, peoples, and resources. The geography of the Americas was being slowly, and often inaccurately, assembled in European minds from the fragments of observation and report that each voyage contributed. Juan Ponce de Leon had visited the Atlantic coast of Florida in 1513. During the expedition that gave the peninsula its Spanish name, La Florida, a name whose precise origin is debated, but which may relate to the Easter season of his arrival or to the abundance of flowers he observed. Whether Ponce de Leon's 1513 voyage brought him to the southwest Gulf Coast of Florida, as well as the Atlantic coast, is a matter of historical discussion. But what is clear is that Spanish knowledge of Florida was accumulating through the early decades of the 16th century. And the Gulf Coast of the peninsula was becoming known as a place with a substantial and formidable indigenous population. Ponce de Leon returned to Florida in 1521 with an expedition that aimed to establish a Spanish settlement on the Gulf Coast. The accounts of this expedition, though not detailed enough to allow precise reconstruction of every event, describe an encounter with indigenous people, almost certainly the Calusa, that ended in violence. Ponce de Leon's party was attacked. He was wounded by an arrow during the fighting, and the expedition withdrew to Cuba, where Ponce de Leon died from his wound. The attempt to establish a Spanish presence on the southwest coast of Florida had failed, and it had failed because the people who lived there had no intention of accommodating it. This was not an isolated episode. Spanish expeditions to the Florida Gulf Coast in the decades that followed encountered consistent, organized, and effective resistance from the Calusa. The historical record from this period is fragmentary. The documents are incomplete, the accounts are often second-hand, and the Spanish perspective is dominant in what survives, but the pattern is clear enough. The Calusa were not simply reacting defensively to intrusions. They were actively managing their encounters with the Spanish in ways that suggest political deliberation rather than instinctive response. The Spanish, for their part, were initially interested in Florida primarily as a strategic location, and in some accounts, as a potential source of enslaved labor for Caribbean operations, the brutal reality of early Spanish colonial practice in the Americas. The reputation that the Gulf Coast of Florida acquired as a place of dangerous resistance may have discouraged sustained colonization attempts for decades, though Spanish ships continued to appear in the region intermittently, some as deliberate expeditions and some as the result of navigational disaster. The Gulf Coast was a graveyard for Spanish shipping. The shallow waters, unpredictable weather, and hurricane-prone coastline sent numerous vessels onto the shoals and beaches of southwest Florida, and the survivors of those shipwrecks sometimes found themselves as captives among the Calusa. Some of these castaways, people who had survived shipwreck and spent months or years living among the Calusa before any possibility of rescue arose, left accounts, or were described in later documents that provide some of the most detailed and human glimpses of Calusa life available from the colonial period. Their perspectives were necessarily shaped by their circumstances, by fear, by cultural displacement, by the particular situations in which they found themselves. But they also observed aspects of Calusa society from within in ways that official expeditions could not. One of the most discussed of these figures is Hernando de Escalante Fontaine, a Spaniard who was shipwrecked on the Florida coast as a young man, probably in the 1540s, and who spent approximately 17 years living among the indigenous peoples of South Florida, including the Calusa, before being rescued. His memoir, written after his return to European society, is one of the most significant documentary sources on the Calusa available from the 16th century. It describes the geography of South Florida, the peoples who inhabited different parts of it, aspects of Calusa's social organization and leadership, and the particular character of Calusa's resistance to Spanish authority. Fontaine's account must be read carefully. It was written by a European man who had spent years in a traumatic and disorienting captivity, who was writing for a European audience, and whose recollections were shaped by his own experiences, biases, and purposes. But it preserves information that no other source provides, and it is an indispensable, if imperfect, window into the Calusa world before the period of sustained Spanish missionary contact. What the Spanish were encountering in southwest Florida was not a disorganized collection of coastal communities that could be easily subordinated or dispersed. They were encountering a politically organized, geographically knowledgeable, and resolutely independent society, one whose leaders understood clearly what Spanish colonialism meant and had reasons to resist it at every opportunity. The most sustained and documented period of Spanish-Calusa interaction occurred in the 1560s, during the era of Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, the Spanish colonial administrator who founded St. Augustine on the Atlantic coast of Florida in 1565, and who attempted, with considerably more ambition than success, to extend Spanish authority across the Florida peninsula. Menéndez was a capable and determined colonial official, and his approach to the Calusa was more politically sophisticated than simple military confrontation. He understood, or came to understand, that direct military conquest of the Calusa in their coastal landscape was not a straightforward proposition. The geography that protected the Calusa, the shallow waters, the labyrinthine channels, the mangrove coastlines, made large-scale military operations against them extremely difficult. Spanish ships could not easily penetrate the interior of the estuarine system. Spanish soldiers on foot in the wetland terrain of southwest Florida were at an enormous disadvantage against people who had lived in that landscape for their entire lives. Menéndez recognized that political engagement was necessary. The Calusa ruler of this period is identified in Spanish documents as Carlos, the name assigned to him or adopted for diplomatic purposes during Spanish interaction. Carlos was, by the account of Spanish observers, a formidable political figure, a man of evident intelligence and strong will who understood the political situation he was navigating with considerable clarity. He had inherited a position of significant regional power, and he was not inclined to compromise it to accommodate Spanish demands. Menéndez visited Carlos in person, a journey to the Calusa capital that required traveling by boat through the shallow coastal waters of southwest Florida, and arriving at a settlement that the Spanish accounts describe in terms that convey both its scale and its unfamiliarity. The visit was a diplomatic encounter of considerable complexity. Carlos and Menéndez were both politically experienced men, each representing a different kind of power and each with specific goals that were not easily compatible. Carlos, as the Spanish documents describe him, sought from Menéndez military alliance against his enemies, neighboring peoples with whom the Calusa were in conflict, and the practical benefits that Spanish military technology might provide. Menéndez sought Calusa cooperation with Spanish colonial aims, including the release of captive Spaniards held among the Calusa and the acceptance of Catholic missionaries into Calusa communities. The relationship was one of negotiation between two political systems that recognized each other's power, even as they each sought to leverage that recognition to their own advantage. What the Spanish wanted most fundamentally was compliance, the acknowledgement of Spanish sovereignty, and the opening of Calusa society to missionary transformation. What the Calusa ruler wanted was alliance on his own terms, without the subordination that Spanish sovereignty implied. These goals were not compatible, and the apparent cordiality of the diplomatic encounters between Menéndez and Carlos concealed a fundamental tension that would not resolve quietly. The Spanish accounts describe Menéndez agreeing to a marriage alliance with Carlos, a diplomatic practice that had precedence in both European and indigenous political tradition, though the details and the actual nature of this arrangement are interpreted differently by different historians. A Spanish garrison was briefly established at the Calusa settlement, and missionaries were stationed there to begin the work of religious conversion. The missionaries found their work nearly impossible. The Calusa showed no meaningful interest in abandoning their own religious practices and spiritual authorities in favor of Christianity. Carlos himself, according to Spanish accounts, that must be read with the understanding that they were written by people who considered his resistance a moral and political problem, maintained his own ceremonial and political authority with no apparent intention of relinquishing it. The Spanish garrison was in a precarious position, isolated in an unfamiliar landscape, dependent on Calusa tolerance for its basic survival. Carlos was killed by the Spanish, according to some accounts, in circumstances that reflect the escalating tension of the encounter and the impossibility of the position both sides had maneuvered into. His successor, identified in Spanish documents as Felipe, continued the same fundamental pattern of resistance, with modifications appropriate to the new circumstances. The broader pattern of Calusa-Spanish interaction across this period is one of a coastal society that consistently refused to become a compliant subject of the colonial system, that negotiated, resisted, accommodated strategically when necessary, and maintained its political independence through a combination of geographical advantage, political skill, and the simple fact that the Spanish did not have the resources or the logistical capacity to impose their authority on a coastal kingdom in an environment that systematically worked against them. The Calusa did not win these encounters in any simple sense. The interactions were costly, disruptive, and ultimately part of a broader pattern of pressure that would accumulate across the following decades. But neither did they simply submit. The story of the Calusa and the Spanish is not the story of a society that collapsed upon contact with European power. It is the story of a society that engaged that power on its own terms for as long as it possibly could. Of all the pressures that bore down on the Calusa world across the period of European contact, the one that the historical and archaeological record is most difficult to measure precisely, and perhaps the one that ultimately mattered most was disease. The introduction of Old World infectious diseases to indigenous populations in the Americas is one of the most consequential and devastating demographic events in human history. European diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, and others struck populations that had no prior exposure and therefore no inherited or acquired immunity to these pathogens. The results, across the Americas and across the period following European contact, were catastrophic in ways that are difficult to fully comprehend. Population declines of 50, 60, 70, and in some regions even higher percentages have been documented or estimated for various indigenous communities in the Americas across the centuries following European arrival. For the Calusa, the precise demographic impact of introduced diseases is genuinely difficult to establish from the available evidence. We do not have population census figures from before contact. We do not have detailed mortality records from the 16th and 17th centuries for the Calusa specifically. The documentary sources from the period of Spanish contact give us occasional glimpses of a society under pressure, but do not provide the kind of systematic demographic data that would allow confident quantitative estimates. What we can say, based on the broader pattern of indigenous demographic collapse in the Americas, and on the fragmentary evidence from Florida specifically, is that epidemic disease almost certainly struck the Calusa at some point or points during the 16th and 17th centuries, and that its effects on a society as politically organized and as regionally influential as the Calusa would have been profound. The political system of the Calusa was dependent, as all political systems are, on people, on the rulers and specialists and warriors and fishermen and community members whose presence and participation made the system function. A significant reduction in population does not simply shrink a society proportionally. It disrupts it in ways that can be disproportionate to the raw numbers. The loss of experienced leaders, skilled specialists, or significant portions of particular communities can fracture political relationships and economic systems that depended on those specific people and their knowledge. A fishing weir maintained by a community of a certain size becomes unmanageable if the community is reduced by half. A tribute system maintained by a network of communities becomes unstable if some of those communities lose the population necessary to meet their obligations. The archaeological record from Southwest Florida shows evidence of changes in settlement patterns and site occupation across the period of and following European contact, changes that may reflect, among other factors, the demographic effects of disease on Calusa communities. Settlements that appear to have been occupied continuously for centuries show signs of reduced activity or abandonment in the historic period. The spatial organization of the Calusa world begins to contract. Spanish missionary accounts from the 17th century describe a Calusa population that, while still present and still politically recognizable, was significantly smaller than the picture suggested by earlier accounts. Whether this decline was primarily the result of disease, or whether it reflected a combination of disease, conflict, political disruption, and other factors, is a question that cannot be answered with precision from the available evidence. The honest answer is that it was almost certainly all of these things operating together, reinforcing each other in ways that compounded the impact of each individual pressure. The invisibility of epidemic disease, its ability to cause catastrophic harm without leaving the kind of dramatic physical record that military conflict or deliberate destruction produces, means that its role in the decline of indigenous societies in the Americas has sometimes been underestimated in popular accounts that focus on conquest and conflict. For the Calusa, as for many indigenous peoples of the Americas, the most devastating enemy may have been one that arrived silently, before any soldier or missionary carried on the breath of the first European visitors, and spreading through communities before any formal encounter had taken place. The shells in the middens cannot tell us how many people died of smallpox, but the changing patterns of the archaeological record, read carefully by researchers who understand what those changes mean, tell a story of a society under pressure from forces it could not directly confront or resist. The 17th century brought the Calusa no relief from the pressures that had begun accumulating in the 16th. If anything, those pressures intensified and multiplied, combining in ways that placed the Calusa political world under a strain that no single generation could resolve. Spanish colonial Florida had its center of gravity on the Atlantic coast, at St. Augustine, which served as the administrative and military capital of Spanish Florida from 1565 onward. The Spanish colonial enterprise in Florida was never fully funded, never fully staffed, and never truly capable of exercising the kind of comprehensive control over the peninsula that colonial administrators in Havana or Madrid might have imagined. But it was persistent. Spanish missionaries extended their mission system across the interior of the peninsula, establishing a chain of missions that eventually reached into North Florida and the Panhandle. The mission system transformed the lives of the indigenous peoples it encompassed, requiring agricultural labor, imposing Christian religious practice, and fundamentally disrupting the social and economic organization of communities brought within its reach. The Calusa remained, through much of the 17th century, outside the direct reach of the Spanish mission system. Their coastal location and their demonstrated willingness to resist Spanish authority had established a kind of de facto independence. Spanish missionaries occasionally made attempts to establish themselves among the Calusa, but those attempts were consistently unsuccessful. The Calusa leadership had no more interest in the mission system in the 17th century than it had shown in the 16th. But independence from the mission system did not mean insulation from the broader consequences of Spanish colonialism across the peninsula. The mission system and the military conflicts associated with Spanish expansion and with the competing English colonial presence in the Carolinas to the north was systematically disrupting and depopulating the indigenous communities of Florida. Peoples who had once been part of the larger network of indigenous relationships in the peninsula, communities with whom the Calusa had maintained tributary, trade, or other political relationships, were being absorbed, displaced, or destroyed by the pressures of the colonial era. The slave raids conducted by English colonial forces from South Carolina, using indigenous allies from the Carolinas and Georgia, were devastating to the mission communities of North Florida in the early 18th century, but their disruption radiated outward, destabilizing the entire indigenous political landscape of the peninsula. As the mission communities collapsed, the network of relationships that had structured indigenous life across Florida began to dissolve, and the political world of the Calusa, which had been embedded in that broader network, lost important components of its context and coherence. At the same time, a new indigenous presence was beginning to appear in the Florida peninsula. Peoples from the Creek Confederacy of what is today Alabama and Georgia, collectively ancestral to the Seminole, began moving into the depopulated lands of northern Florida during the early 18th century. These were not the same peoples as the Calusa's historical neighbors and tributaries. They were culturally and politically distinct, and their movement into Florida added a new and unfamiliar element to the already disrupted indigenous landscape of the peninsula. The Calusa world, which had been organized around specific relationships with specific peoples in specific places, was losing the landscape of relationships within which it had always operated. The political system that the Calusa had built over centuries was a system designed for and embedded in a particular world, a world of interconnected coastal and interior communities with established relationships, understood hierarchies, and shared patterns of exchange. That world was being unmade by forces that originated far beyond the mangrove coastlines of southwest Florida, and the physical landscape was not static either. Environmental changes in sea level, in the extent and character of the mangrove forests, in the availability of particular resources, were interacting with the human disruptions of the colonial era in ways that added yet another layer of pressure to a society already under severe strain. The coast that the Calusa had managed and modified over centuries was changing in ways that their accumulated environmental knowledge, though deep and sophisticated, had not been designed to address. The kingdom was not falling dramatically. It was fraying at its margins and at its center, under pressures that were simultaneously political, biological, social, economic, and environmental, a convergence of forces that no single political response, however skilled, could have resolved. There is a temptation, when trying to understand what happened to the Calusa, to reach for a dramatic ending, a single catastrophic event, a decisive moment of collapse, a night when everything that had been the Calusa world simply ceased to be. The title of this documentary uses the word sunken, and that word carries implications of sudden submergence, of a world swallowed whole by history or geography. But the actual story is more complicated, and in some ways more interesting than any sudden disappearance. The Calusa political world did not sink in one night. It did not end in a single battle, a single epidemic, a single Spanish decree, or a single storm. It dissolved across a long and painful stretch of time, across the 17th century and into the 18th, through the accumulated weight of demographic collapse, political disruption, environmental change, and the steady erosion of the network of relationships and communities that had given the Calusa system its coherence and its power. By the early 18th century, the Calusa population had declined catastrophically from what it had been at the time of first Spanish contact. The precise numbers are not recoverable from the available evidence, but Spanish documents from the early 18th century describe a Calusa community that was a shadow of its former size and political reach. The tributary system that had once extended Calusa influence across much of South Florida was no longer functioning in any recognizable form. The subordinate communities that had once sent tribute to the political center at or near Mound Key were gone, absorbed into the mission system, killed by epidemic disease, or displaced by the cascading disruptions of the colonial era. In 1711, a significant number of Calusa, perhaps the remnants of multiple surviving Calusa communities drawn together by their shared precariousness, evacuated the southwest coast of Florida and traveled to Cuba under Spanish protection. This migration, documented in Spanish records, represents one of the most poignant moments in the long story of the Calusa people, a community that had lived for thousands of years on the coast of southwest Florida, that had shaped its landscape and been shaped by it across generations beyond counting, found itself without the population, the political structure, or the environmental conditions necessary to sustain its traditional way of life, and accepted the invitation of a colonial power it had resisted for nearly 2 centuries to relocate to a Spanish colonial island. What happened to the Calusa who went to Cuba, and whether there were Calusa who remained in Florida rather than making the journey, are questions that the historical record does not fully resolve. Some accounts suggest that a remnant Calusa population may have persisted in the Florida Keys or in the extreme southwestern tip of the peninsula for some years after 1711. Others suggest that the Cuban migrants faced difficult conditions in Havana and that the community continued to diminish there. The historical trail grows faint and then disappears from the documentary record. The question of Calusa cultural and biological descendants is one that researchers and community members continue to engage with, though the historical disruptions of the colonial era make clear genealogical continuity difficult to establish through surviving records. The title of this documentary, The Sunken Shell Kingdom, is, in the end, a metaphor. The Calusa kingdom did not literally sink beneath the Gulf of Mexico. Individual coastal features, shell deposits, low-lying areas of former occupation have certainly been submerged by the gradual rise of sea level over the centuries, and some portions of the ancient Calusa landscape now lie beneath the shallow waters of the estuaries. That is real. But the larger sinking was political and demographic, the slow subsidence of a complex political world beneath the weight of pressures it could not withstand. And here is the thing about that sinking. The shells remained, the ridges remained. The mounds remained, rising from the mangrove coastlines of southwest Florida. The landscape that the Calusa had built over 2,000 years and more did not disappear when the political system that had created it dissolved. It persisted quietly beneath the vegetation, beneath the soil, beneath the shallow water, waiting for the people who would eventually come looking for it with patience, with curiosity, and with the tools of archaeology. What happened after the Calusa political world ended is not a story of total erasure. It is a story of what persists when people are gone, and of what the things they left behind can still tell us if we are willing to listen carefully enough to the shells. There is a particular quality to archaeological evidence that distinguishes it from every other kind of historical record. A written document was composed by someone with a purpose: to report, to persuade, to record, to justify. It carries within it the perspective of its author and the assumptions of the moment and culture in which it was written. A shell in a midden has no author. It carries no agenda. It did not choose to be deposited in a particular layer at a particular moment in time. It simply fell where it fell, was covered by what came after it, and waited. That patience is the foundation of what archaeology can tell us about the Calusa. The shell deposits of southwest Florida are, in the most literal sense, a record, a stratigraphy of human activity laid down across centuries and, in some cases, millennia, preserving within its layers information about the people who created it that no colonial document could provide. Every layer in a shell midden is a chapter. The sequence of layers is a timeline, and the contents of those layers, the species of shellfish, represented the sizes of individual shells, the mix of animal bones, the ceramic fragments, the charred plant remains. The occasional worked shell tool or piece of trade material are the sentences and words of that chapter, waiting to be read by people trained in the particular discipline of reading them. The zooarchaeological record from Calusa sites has proven especially informative. Zooarchaeology, the study of animal remains from archaeological sites, can tell us a remarkable amount about how people lived, what they ate, how they managed resources, and how the environment around them changed over time. At Calusa sites, the fish bones preserved in shell middens and archaeological deposits reveal the species composition of the local fish community at different periods of occupation, the size of individual fish being caught, and by extension, the fishing methods and intensities being employed. A midden layer dominated by large, mature fish of particular species suggests different fishing practices and possibly different environmental conditions than a layer dominated by smaller individuals of a different species mix. This kind of evidence has allowed researchers to begin reconstructing the history of the estuarine ecosystem itself across the period of Calusa occupation. The estuary of southwest Florida was not identical in the 1st century of the Common Era, and in the 15th century, and in the 17th century. Sea levels were changing, slowly but consequentially. Mangrove distributions shifted as coastal conditions changed. The availability of particular fish species varied with environmental conditions. And the Calusa, across their long occupation of this coast, were both responding to those environmental changes and contributing to them through their management of the estuary and its resources. Ceramic evidence from Calusa sites, the fragments of pottery vessels found within shell deposits and associated features, helps establish chronology and provides information about trade and interaction. The ceramic traditions of Southwest Florida changed across the long sequence of coastal occupation, and those changes can be used to date different layers and features within sites, helping to build the timeline that gives the archaeological record its historical structure. Non-local ceramics, pieces that appear to have been made somewhere other than Southwest Florida, indicate the movements of people or objects through exchange networks. Shell tools are another category of evidence that repays careful attention. The tools fashioned from whelk shells at Calusa sites are not crude or simple objects. They are carefully made, reflecting both skill in their manufacture and a deep familiarity with the properties of the material. Large columella tools, tools fashioned from the central column of large whelk shells, were used for working wood and other materials. Shell dippers made from the body whorls of large whelks served practical purposes. The range and sophistication of shell tool assemblages at Calusa sites reflects a material culture that had developed deep expertise in working with the most abundant and versatile raw material the environment provided. What the shells cannot tell us is in some ways as significant as what they can. They cannot tell us what language the Calusa spoke with any fullness or nuance. They cannot reconstruct the internal life of a community, its social tensions, its affections, its humor, its grief. They cannot recover the knowledge that was held in memory and transmitted through practice rather than through material culture. The intricate environmental knowledge of tides and currents and fish, behavior, the political wisdom accumulated through generations of leadership. The understanding of the night sky and the seasons and the patterns of the estuary that guided daily life. But what they can tell us is considerable, and researchers have been finding new ways to ask better questions of the evidence that the shells preserve. The modern archaeological investigation of the Calusa world is a story of patient, sustained, methodologically sophisticated work carried out over decades by researchers who have committed themselves to understanding one of the most complex and rewarding archaeological landscapes in North America. The Calusa Culture Research Program, developed through the Florida Museum of Natural History and associated principally with the work of archaeologist William Marquardt, has been central to the modern understanding of the Calusa. Beginning in the 1980s and continuing across subsequent decades, this research program brought together archaeologists, zooarchaeologists, paleoecologists, environmental historians, and other specialists to investigate the Calusa archaeological record in ways that no single discipline could have accomplished alone. The program's work at Pineland, at Mound Key, and at other sites across the Southwest Florida region has produced a body of scholarship that has fundamentally transformed what the broader research community knows about the Calusa. At Mound Key, archaeological fieldwork conducted in recent years by a team led by researchers from the Florida Museum of Natural History and including collaborators from the University of Florida and international institutions, has used a combination of traditional excavation and modern remote sensing to investigate the site in unprecedented detail. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have been used to examine subsurface features at the site without disturbing the archaeological deposits, a method that can reveal the presence and depth of buried features, including architectural remains, shell concentrations, and other elements of the site's internal structure. These surveys have contributed to the identification of what appear to be the remains of large structures at the site, including features that may correspond to the substantial buildings described in Spanish accounts of the Calusa capital. Airborne LiDAR, light detection and ranging, has been applied to the southwest Florida landscape to map topographic features at a resolution that reveals subtle variations in ground surface that are invisible to the naked eye. In an environment where the relevant archaeological features are often shell ridges and mounds that rise only a few feet above the surrounding terrain, the ability to map those features precisely across large areas has transformed the spatial understanding of Calusa site organization. LiDAR surveys in the region have revealed the extent and complexity of shell feature distributions at sites including Pineland, and have suggested the presence of landscape modifications in areas between known sites that warrant further investigation. Environmental archaeology and paleoecology have been particularly important components of the modern research program. Sediment cores extracted from the bay's estuaries and wetlands surrounding Calusa sites preserve a record of environmental change extending back thousands of years. A record that includes information about sea level history, mangrove distributions, sediment inputs, and the overall character of the coastal environment across the long period of Calusa occupation. Analyzing those cores requires a range of specialized techniques: the identification of pollen grains, the examination of diatoms, and other microscopic organisms, the analysis of sediment chemistry, and the results have been integrated with the archaeological record to produce a picture of the Calusa that is simultaneously a human history and an environmental history. Radiocarbon dating has been applied to organic materials from Calusa sites, charcoal, shell, bone, and other materials that preserve carbon in forms suitable for isotopic analysis, to establish the chronology of occupation at individual sites and to correlate the sequences identified at different sites into a regional timeline. The results have confirmed the extraordinary depth of human occupation at major Calusa sites and have helped to establish the sequence of landscape modification events, the accumulation of particular shell features, the construction of specific mounds and ridges within the longer history of site occupation. The analysis of stable isotopes in human and animal remains from Calusa sites has provided information about diet, mobility, and ecological relationships that complements the evidence from zooarchaeology and paleoenvironmental research. Isotopic signatures in skeletal material can indicate where individuals spent their lives, what they ate, and how their diet changed across different life stages. Information that contributes to understanding both the daily life of Calusa communities and the larger patterns of movement and exchange that connected different parts of the Calusa world. What emerges from all of this research, from the excavation reports and the sediment cores and the LiDAR maps and the isotopic analyses and the ceramic studies, is not a complete picture. It is a partial picture, carefully assembled from fragmentary evidence, with gaps and uncertainties clearly acknowledged by the researchers who have produced it. But it is a vastly more detailed and nuanced picture than existed a generation ago. And it continues to grow as new fieldwork is conducted, new analytical techniques are applied, and new questions are asked of the evidence that the Southwest Florida landscape preserves. The archaeologist working in Southwest Florida is not simply looking for objects. She is looking for an entire world, for the spatial organization of communities, the ecological context of human choices, the material traces of political relationships, and the physical record of a society that left no written language of its own, but inscribed its history indelibly in the shell and sediment of the coast it inhabited. That world is still there, beneath the mangroves and the shallow water and the soil of the shell ridges. It is waiting, as it has always waited, for the next careful question. The same coastal environment that sustained the Calusa for thousands of years is now changing at a rate and in ways that pose serious threats to the archaeological record that environment preserves. Sea level rise, driven by the thermal expansion of ocean water and the melting of polar ice in response to global warming, is an ongoing reality on the southwest coast of Florida, and its effects on low-lying coastal archaeological sites are already measurable. The shell mounds and ridges that constitute the primary archaeological record of the Calusa sit at elevations that range from just above current sea level to the relatively modest heights of the highest mounds at sites like Mound Key. As sea level rises incrementally, the lower-lying portions of these sites are increasingly subject to tidal inundation, saltwater intrusion, and the physical erosion that comes with wave action against unprotected shell surfaces. The mangrove forests that currently colonize the margins of many Calusa shell sites provide some degree of natural protection against erosion. Their root systems trap sediment and absorb wave energy, functioning as a buffer between the open water and the elevated shell features behind them. But mangrove distributions are themselves changing in response to sea level rise and other environmental changes, and the protective relationship between the mangrove margin and the shell deposits it currently shelters cannot be assumed to remain stable as conditions continue to shift. Hurricanes are a recurring and intensifying threat to the archaeological sites of Southwest Florida. The Gulf Coast of Florida has always been hurricane country. The historical and geological record makes clear that powerful storms have struck this coastline repeatedly across the millennia of human occupation. The Calusa certainly experienced major hurricanes during their long occupation of the coast, and the question of how such storms affected their shell landscape and their communities is one that researchers have begun to address through the analysis of storm event layers preserved in sediment cores and archaeological deposits. But the contemporary concern is not historical hurricanes. It is the combination of ongoing sea level rise with the increased intensity of Atlantic hurricane activity associated with warming ocean surface temperatures. A storm surge that might have topped out below the height of a particular shell mound platform in an earlier era may, under future conditions of higher baseline sea level, reach or exceed that elevation, exposing archaeological deposits that have been protected by their elevation for centuries to sudden and potentially severe disturbance. Hurricane Ian, which struck southwest Florida in September 2022 with catastrophic force, caused significant damage to the coastline of Lee County and the surrounding region, including areas that contain major Calusa archaeological sites. The assessment of the storm's impact on specific sites and the documentation of any damage to archaeological deposits and features is part of the ongoing work of researchers and resource managers in the region. The storm served as a vivid reminder that the threats to the Calusa archaeological record are not theoretical or distant. They are present and immediate. Coastal erosion from boat wakes and other forms of human disturbance adds to the natural erosion processes that affect shell sites. The physical structure of a shell mound, a loose aggregation of shells, sediment, and organic material, is vulnerable to the physical disturbance of repeated wave action. And the increased boat traffic in the estuaries of southwest Florida associated with modern recreational use introduces erosive forces that were not part of the historical environment of these sites. Unauthorized digging and artifact collection at shell sites has been an ongoing problem across the history of Florida archaeology. The Archaeological Resources Protection Act and Florida's own archaeological protection laws provide legal frameworks for the protection of archaeological sites, but enforcement across the hundreds of miles of coastal and interior landscape that contains Calusa sites is a persistent challenge. Objects removed from archaeological sites without proper documentation are lost to science. They become decontextualized artifacts rather than pieces of evidence embedded in a stratigraphic record that gives them their historical meaning. The researchers, site managers, resource protection officers, and preservation advocates who work to protect the Calusa archaeological record are doing so under conditions of genuine urgency. The sites themselves are irreplaceable. The information they contain about the Calusa, about the long human history of southwest Florida, about the relationship between coastal societies and coastal environments across thousands of years, cannot be recovered once it is destroyed. Each damaged mound, each eroded ridge, each disturbed stratigraphic layer represents a permanent loss of historical knowledge. The water that once sustained the Calusa now threatens the memory of them. That is not a poetic exaggeration. It is a straightforward description of the environmental and preservation situation that researchers and managers are working within every day on the southwest coast of Florida. And yet much remains. That is the other part of the story, and it deserves to be told with the same care as the account of what has been lost or threatened. Mound Key Archaeological State Park protects the island of Mound Key and the extraordinary shell landscape it contains. The park is accessible by boat from Estero Bay, and it receives visitors who come to walk the trails that wind across the island's elevated shell surface to look out from the height of the Mound summits across the still water of the bay. And to understand, or begin to understand, what kind of place this was and what kind of people made it. The state of Florida's commitment to protecting Mound Key as an archaeological state park represents a recognition of the site's significance that benefits both the research community and the public. The Randell Research Center at Pineland, operated by the Florida Museum of Natural History, provides another kind of protected and publicly accessible window into the Calusa world. The center maintains a nature trail through portions of the Pineland Archaeological Site Complex, offers educational programs, and serves as a base for ongoing archaeological research at the site. It is a model of how archaeological research and public interpretation can be conducted together in a way that serves both the scholarly community and the general public. The Florida Museum of Natural History in Gainesville holds significant collections of Calusa archaeological materials, artifacts, faunal remains, ceramic assemblages, and associated documentation that continue to serve as a foundation for ongoing research. The museum's collections represent decades of careful archaeological work across Southwest Florida, and they preserve evidence that can be reanalyzed with new methods as analytical technologies improve. Local museums and historical societies in Southwest Florida maintain collections and interpretive materials related to Calusa history. The Collier County Museum. The Mound House on Fort Myers Beach, the Artathikai Museum of the Seminole Tribe of Florida, which focuses primarily on Seminole history but provides important context for the broader Indigenous history of Florida, and other institutions contribute to the public understanding of the region's deep human past. The archaeological sites themselves, not just Mound Key and Pineland, but dozens of shell mound sites scattered across the coastal landscape of Southwest Florida, are the most important surviving remnant of the Calusa world. Many of these sites are on protected land, whether as state parks, conservation areas, or protected archaeological sites. Others remain on private land, where their fate depends on the choices of individual landowners and the effectiveness of legal protections. Some have been damaged or destroyed by development across the decades of rapid coastal Florida growth in the 20th century. Shell mound material was historically used as road fill material in Florida, a practice that destroyed numerous sites before the archaeological significance of shell deposits was widely understood or legally protected. What survives represents a fraction of what once existed as the full Calusa archaeological landscape, but that fraction is still substantial. The surviving sites preserve information sufficient to support decades of future research and the continued application of new analytical methods. New remote sensing approaches, improved isotopic techniques, advances in ancient DNA analysis where applicable, and improvements in paleoenvironmental reconstruction means that the surviving evidence will continue to yield new insights as the research community brings new tools and new questions to it. The Calusa political world ended. The knowledge held by the last Calusa-speaking people has not survived in a recoverable form. The tribute relationships and political hierarchies and ceremonial life of the Calusa kingdom exist now only in fragmentary colonial documents and in the physical traces preserved in the shell and sediment of the southwest Florida coast. But those traces are real. They are there. And they continue to speak, in the patient language of archaeology, to anyone willing to listen with the care and discipline that the evidence deserves. There is a particular kind of intellectual honesty that distinguishes the best historical and archaeological scholarship. The willingness to say clearly and without embarrassment that some things are not known, that some questions cannot currently be answered, and that the boundary between knowledge and speculation is a boundary worth respecting even when it is uncomfortable to do so. The study of the Calusa has produced a great deal of knowledge across the past several decades. But it has also produced a clearer understanding of how much remains uncertain, and that uncertainty is itself a form of historical knowledge, a map of the questions that future research might illuminate. The population of the Calusa at the time of first European contact is not known with any precision. Estimates in the scholarly literature vary considerably, and the methodological challenges of reconstructing pre-contact indigenous population sizes from the available evidence are formidable. The shell mound deposits can suggest the scale and duration of occupation at individual sites, but translating that evidence into reliable population figures requires assumptions about household size, site contemporaneity, the proportion of the population represented at any given site, and other factors that cannot be established with confidence from the existing evidence. Any specific population figure for the Calusa should be understood as an informed estimate rather than an established fact. The internal political organization of the Calusa, the precise mechanisms by which authority was exercised, tribute was extracted and redistributed, and succession was managed, is described in Spanish documents, but only partially and from an outside perspective. The Spanish observers who wrote about the Calusa political system were trying to understand it in terms that made sense to them, and they almost certainly missed nuances, misunderstood details, and imposed their own political categories on a system that did not map neatly onto those categories. The actual workings of Calusa governance, at the level of detail that would allow a full political history to be written, remain significantly obscured. The religious and ceremonial life of the Calusa is perhaps the most poorly understood aspect of their culture. Spanish missionary accounts describe religious practices from the perspective of people who considered those practices wrong and who were attempting to replace them with Christianity. The descriptions they provide are therefore both partial and distorted, shaped by the purposes of the observer and by the categories of Catholic religious thought, which did not provide an appropriate framework for understanding a different religious tradition on its own terms. What we can say with confidence is that the Calusa had a rich ceremonial life, and that religious authority was an important component of the political system. The specific content of their beliefs and practices, the stories, the ceremonies, the understandings of the world and of human existence that structured their spiritual life, is not recoverable from the surviving evidence. The question of the Calusa language remains open in ways that are genuinely frustrating. A handful of words and phrases recorded in colonial documents give linguists a small amount of material to work with, but it is not enough to allow meaningful reconstruction of the language as a grammatical system or as a vehicle of literary or intellectual tradition. The loss of the Calusa language is a loss that goes far beyond the merely academic. It represents the disappearance of an entire way of articulating human experience that existed nowhere else in the world. The extent and character of Calusa trade networks, the full reach of the connections that brought exotic materials into Southwest Florida and sent shell products outward, is only partially known. The archaeological evidence for long-distance exchange is real and significant, but the full spatial extent of those networks, the specific mechanisms through which exchange was conducted, and the social relationships that sustained it are questions that the current evidence can only partially address. The precise chronology of specific events in Calusa political history, when particular settlements were established or abandoned, when specific political changes occurred, how rapidly or slowly the demographic decline proceeded, is constrained by the resolution of the available dating methods and by gaps in the documentary record. Radiocarbon dating provides ranges rather than precise dates, and the colonial documents that describe specific events are often undated, contradictory, or preserved only in later copies that may have introduced errors. Future research will almost certainly narrow some of these uncertainties. New excavations, new analytical techniques, new archival discoveries in Spanish colonial repositories, and new theoretical frameworks for understanding coastal indigenous societies will all contribute to a picture that will look different and more complete a generation from now than it does today. That is the nature of historical and archaeological knowledge. It grows, it revises itself, it becomes more precise over time, even as it also discovers new questions that earlier generations of researchers had not thought to ask. The mystery of the Calusa is not the mystery of a people who vanished without a trace. It is the mystery of a people whose traces are real and abundant, but whose full story, the interior life, the intellectual world. The names and voices and thoughts of the individuals who built and inhabited the shell ridges of Southwest Florida remains and will perhaps always remain just beyond the reach of what the evidence can recover. That is a real limitation. And it is worth sitting with it honestly rather than filling the gaps with invention. The night comes slowly to Southwest Florida. The light does not drop suddenly here the way it does in other landscapes. It thins gradually from the bright flat white of midday to the warm amber of late afternoon, and then to a softer gold that spreads across the water of the bay in long, low bands as the sun moves toward the Gulf. The mangroves on the far shore of the estuary lose their individual definition and become a single dark line against the fading sky. The water reflects the color above it for a long time after the sun itself has gone. And then the bay becomes dark, and quiet and very still. If you were sitting on the elevated ground of a shell mound on a night like this, the ground firm beneath you composed of the accumulated shells of 10,000 meals and 100 generations. The warm air moving softly off the water, the sound of the estuary settling into its night rhythms around you, you might feel in a way that is difficult to articulate the depth of time that this place contains. The Calusa sat on this ground, not metaphorically, not in imagination. They sat on the shell ridges and the mound summits of southwest Florida and watched the same water darken under the same sky. And they understood this landscape in ways that we can only begin to approximate through archaeology and environmental science, and the patient reading of colonial documents written by people who did not fully understand what they were seeing. The shells beneath the surface of Mound Key remember something. They remember the weight of the people who walked across them. They remember the fires built on the mound platforms and the structures that rose from those platforms and the voices that moved through the warm air above them. They remember the canoes setting out across the bay in the early morning, when the water was glassy and the herons stood at the tidal edge and the mullet jumped silver in the low light. They remember all of this not in any mystical sense, but in the literal sense that their physical presence, their arrangement, their stratigraphy, their species composition, their chemical signatures, preserves information about the human activity that deposited them. The Calusa River still moves from the interior of the Florida peninsula to the Gulf Coast, as it has for an enormous length of time, carrying the water of the interior southward and westward toward the estuary where it loses itself in the salt. The river does not remember the canoes that traveled its length, carrying tribute and trade and political messages between the coast and the interior communities of the Calusa world. But the sediment on its banks and the pollen and diatoms embedded in that sediment, and the shells of the creatures that lived in its water across the centuries of Calusa occupation. These things preserve a physical record of a world organized around this waterway. A world in which the river was not merely a geographical feature, but a political corridor and an economic artery. Estero Bay is still there. Its water still moves with the tides, still warms under the subtropical sun, still shelters the fish and the birds and the invertebrates that have always found their way into its shallow, productive embrace. Mound Key still rises from the center of the bay, still elevated, still composed of the shell that human hands accumulated there across a period that spans most of recorded history and reaches back into a time before any European had imagined that this coast existed. The archaeologists who work at these sites carry with them a specific and important kind of respect for the people who made these places, for the evidence those people left behind, and for the obligation to interpret that evidence as carefully and honestly as the methods of their discipline allow. They know that they are working at the edge of knowledge, in the space where evidence ends and uncertainty begins, and they take seriously the responsibility of being clear about which side of that boundary they are standing on at any given moment. The Calusa political world is gone. That is simply true, and no amount of atmospheric narration can make it otherwise. The tributary system, the paramount chief, the network of subordinate communities. The ceremonial life, centered on the great mound at the heart of Estero Bay. All of this dissolved across the 17th and early 18th centuries under pressures that the Calusa, despite their remarkable resilience and their political sophistication, could not ultimately withstand. But gone is not the same as forgotten, and forgotten is not the same as lost. The shells are still here, the ridges are still here. The mounds are still here, rising from the mangrove coastline in the morning light, rooted in 2,000 years of human presence that no storm, no century of neglect, and no accumulation of tropical vegetation has been able to entirely erase. The water of the estuary still moves around the base of Mound Key in the pattern that the tides have always imposed on it, and the island still stands at the center of the bay. Elevated above the surrounding water by the accumulated weight of a civilization that built its world from the sea's own discards. The research continues. New questions are asked. New methods are applied. New layers of understanding are added to the picture that archaeology has been building slowly and carefully for decades. The picture will never be complete. The interior life of the Calusa, the language, the stories, the individual human experiences that made up the texture of daily existence on the shell ridges of southwest Florida, is not recoverable from the evidence that survives. That is a genuine loss, and it should be acknowledged as such. But what remains is enough to know that this was a remarkable world. A world built from shells and water and the deep knowledge of an estuarine ecosystem that provided to the people who understood it fully. A foundation for political complexity, cultural sophistication, and long-term human flourishing that matched, and in some ways exceeded, what could be achieved in very different kinds of environments, by very different kinds of means. The Calusa looked out across the same estuary that you might look across today from the bow of a kayak or the deck of a small boat at dusk, and they saw their world clearly, its depths and its shallows, its seasons and its dangers, its abundance and its limits. They managed it across generations with a care and a knowledge that the accumulating archaeological evidence continues to reveal piece by patient piece. The night settles fully over the bay now. The mangroves are dark shapes at the water's edge. The surface of the estuary moves with the tide and catches, here and there, a faint reflection of starlight. Mound Key sits quietly in the center of the water, as it has sat for a very long time, holding within its elevated shell surface the compressed memory of everyone who ever stood there and looked out across this same quiet darkness. The water moves, the shells hold. And the story, incomplete, partially obscured, but real and continuing, waits for the next person willing to kneel in the soil of a shell ridge and ask, with patience and care and genuine respect, what this place remembers. Rest now. The estuary will be here in the morning. It has always been here.